Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We're all excited. Here we are out back on tour and talking again, and it's good to be here. So I'm going to invite Jordan Peterson to come out on stage right away. The first thing I'd like to do is thank David Cotter for coming out. Our musician, we really like listening to him, and we hope that you enjoyed it as well. So thank you, David. And now I'm going to introduce you to two business opportunities that my children have been involved in, and then I'll bring Jord out here, and we're going to discuss some of the questions that you wrote down on Slido. I'm going to choose them. He's going to answer them. So I'll only talk a little bit. First of all, my son Julian developed a writing app based on Jordan's writing guide that he used when he was a university professor. Julian was always interested in teaching, and he was always interested in writing, I remember, when he first went to university. So this was really a nice fit for him. He and a couple other fellows developed this app and launched it in the fall, and it's doing very well. Jord wrote this guide. There's 10 steps to it. So it's not just a formatting app. It's a writing app where you follow these 10 steps, and hopefully at the end of that you'll write the best essay that you've written. And he said, really, at the highest level, your mind is verbal, and if you write down your ideas in a particular way so that you can convey what you mean, your mind will become more organized at a higher level. So this is something that he really believes in, that will bring people a lot of success in what they do. The second thing is my daughter developed an app, or is developing an online university. It's not exactly an app. It's an online university platform. She's bringing professors from all over the world. They're recording 8 hours of lectures, so they'll be in 2-hour segments. This is something that Michaela was very ill when she was a child. She got better as a teenager and then tried to go to university, and she ended up taking, she took Latin, and she took, Greek. She was taking Greek, and a lot of it just had feminist tones in it, and so she quit and didn't do any more humanities. She ended up studying, biology and figuring out her health instead, which is really what she needed to do at that time, but she really missed the humanities opportunity, and so she's very excited about offering these lectures to people, and we're hoping that we'll bring down the cost of a bachelor's degree to something that's reasonable, because it's gotten way out of control. Yeah. And we're hoping that, and the guidelines will be specific, that all the lectures will be there teaching you how to think and not what to think. So those are the two things. And now, without further ado, I would like to invite Jordan Peterson out on stage. I'm very honored to be on stage with him, and let's give him a hand.
Thank you. That's pretty good welcome. for for a bunch of West Coast liberals. So Tammy outlined a couple of projects. I want to tell you about two more. The first one is pending in some sense. A couple of months ago, I did a series of seminars with a number of scholars in Miami. I think we taped 9 two-hour seminars on the first half of the book of Exodus. I'm planning to do a series of public lectures on Exodus akin to the ones I did on Genesis. I've been looking forward to doing this a long time, and I thought that before I did that, I would take the opportunity to discuss the book in some detail with the smartest people that I could find who would be qualified to do such a thing. And I found some very, very smart people, and I learned a lot about the underlying structure of the first half of that text. I thought to begin with that we would get through the entire story in the 8 days we'd put aside, but we only got halfway through and decided to extend it by a factor of 2. We'll tape the rest of it in January. That's going to be released. The Daily Wire Plus people helped me produce that, and they helped set it up. Yeah, it was good of them. We've got other things. We've got other things. So we've got other things planned with them too, which I'll make reference to in a minute. But we're going to release the Exodus seminars on November 25th. So that's coming up pretty soon. And if you like the Genesis lectures, then I really think you'll like these seminars, because they offer the same sort of approach. You know, it's a reverent, in some sense, a reverent approach to the text, predicated on the idea that a story wouldn't survive for that length of time unless there was something to it. And of course, then the question is, what is there to it? I can tell you one thing I learned in a more profound manner, and maybe whet your interest a little bit, because I really think this is worth knowing. So, you know, in the Exodus seminar, or in the Exodus story, it's a classic story in some sense of the struggle for freedom, or that's how it's often stereotyped, but it's much more subtle than that. So there's a portrayal of God in the story of Exodus. And God is a spirit, and you might wonder what a spirit is, and you could think of a spirit psychologically as a pattern of perception and action that might inhabit you and that you could act out. So you could act in the spirit of anger, for example, or you could act in the spirit of desperation. And you understand what it means when someone speaks like that. I acted in a spirit of desperation. And you're saying in some sense that a pattern of perception and behavior overtook you. And you can consider the biblical stories as a series of narrative meditations, or stories about the nature of the spirit that integrates all other spirits. That's another way of thinking about it. So that's what monotheism is, in a sense. It's the attempt to integrate all possible spirits into a single spirit. And that begs the question, and the question is, well, what's the nature of that singular spirit? And that's the same question as what's the nature of God? And the biblical stories, which the Bible's a library, right? It's not a book, it's a library of books. And it's sequenced in a way that is mysterious, because the sequencing was a collective decision that occurred over really tens of thousands of years, but at least thousands of years. And under the operation of forces that we don't really understand. And each of the different biblical stories, unique in and of itself, portrays that uppermost spirit from a different perspective. And so here's the spirit that characterizes the Spirit of God in Exodus. In Exodus, the Spirit of God is the Spirit that calls to people who are enslaved to shed their chains and be free. Okay, and so you might say, well, do you believe in that Spirit? Which is the same question as, do you believe in God? And the answer is, well, if a voice manifests itself within you that calls you to be free, do you attend to it or not? And if you do attend to it, then you believe in it. If you don't attend to it, well, then you believe in something else, like slavery or tyranny. Those are your options. There's no don't believe in that equation. There's just a series of choices about which actions you're going to manifest and which perceptions you're going to allow to guide you. And you abide by some spirit or other. There's no way around that. Maybe it's a fragmented spirit and a disjointed spirit or nihilistic spirit, none of which will do you any good. Or maybe there's some aim within you towards something like a higher unity, and one of the manifestations of that higher unity is the voice that calls the subjugated to freedom. And freedom sounds like freedom from slavery. You know, and that sounds like an untrammeled good, and in fact something easy, because it's difficult to be a slave and easy to be free. It's like, no, it's hard to be a slave, but it's also very hard to be free, which is why people often prefer slavery. So now, the story's set up so that one part of humanity is conceptualized as tyrannical. That's the Pharaoh and the Egyptians, and the other section of humanity is conceptualized as enslaved. And God is also the spirit that chastises the tyrant. And that's an interesting idea, because we do tend to think of tyranny as something implicitly wrong. We think of it as something that violates the natural law. That's another way of thinking about it. That its erroneous nature is self-evident, and that tyrants will be, in some sense, held to justice. And I think there is some justification for holding that view when you consider the terrible end of people like Hitler or Stalin, victim of their own narcissistic malevolence, and inevitably so. And I think you could say the same thing about yourself to some degree, to the degree that you're a tyrant, right? Is that the punishment that you receive for being a tyrant will be in proportion to the degree that you're a tyrant. And you might receive that punishment at the hands of other people, or at the hands of the natural world, as you attempt to enforce your own delusional presuppositions on an intransigent world, or you might receive that punishment as a consequence of tyrannizing yourself. And people do that. You see people do this all the time. You think people have these rigid beliefs that hem them in, that they enforce on themselves and others, and act out the spirit of tyranny within the confines of their own personality. And then you would say that, from the perspective of the book of Exodus, the Spirit of God would be the spirit that calls to you to abandon your own tyrannical presuppositions. And maybe you'll listen to that, maybe you won't. And then you might ask, well, why wouldn't you listen to that? Because if you're tyrannizing yourself and you stopped, then you would no longer be a tyrant or your own slave, and you'd think that would be an improvement. And you might also say that socially, when people are being tyrannized by an external force, so a genuine political tyrant, let's say, they often won't stand up against the tyrant. And you can think about that practically, because there are consequences to standing up against a tyrant. And you might say, well, people are afraid of the consequences, but that's a weak explanation, because there are consequences for not standing up to a tyrant too, and they're pretty damn dismal. But the book of Exodus actually offers a very sophisticated explanation for why people will not abandon their own tyrannical presuppositions, and why they allow themselves to be subjugated to external tyrants. And the answer is, out of the tyranny, into the desert, right? And so, because you can be deluded, and you might think, well, if you just abandoned your own tyrannical presuppositions, or if you stood up against external tyranny, you would move from a condition of slavery to the promised land, right? Things would get better. It's like, that isn't how the story lays itself out. The way the story lays itself out is, no, they get worse first, or they at least get equally bad in a different way, because it isn't obvious at all in the story of Exodus that the plight of the Israelites in the desert is preferable to the plight of the Israelites in the tyranny. And you can see that played out in the political arena constantly. There's no shortage of people, once the Soviet Union collapsed, there were no shortage of people who look back with nostalgia on the good old days of Stalin, right? And so how is that to be understood? Well, if you understand that if you're a tyrant to yourself or to other people, and you abandon those presuppositions, those tyrannical conceptions, and you let them collapse, when they collapse, you're not free, you're just left with nothing. And nothing's the desert. And what happens in the desert? Well, what happens to the Israelites is they start to squabble among themselves, they become fractious, because they were slaves for so long, they have no idea how to orient themselves, and then they start worshiping false idols. And what might you make of that? Well, the root word of idol and ideology is the same word. And so what happens when you abandon the spirit that calls the enslaved to throw off the shackles of tyranny? You abandon your identity with that spirit, you fall prey to diverse, divisive ideologies. And if you can't see the parallel between that situation and the situation we're in right now, you're not using your imagination. It's definitely the case. I'll close that by pointing out something else that I've really learned over the last few months, and I'm writing about this. This is the second part of the announcement. I said I would talk about the 2 more projects. One of them is the Exodus seminar, which will come out on the 25th. I'm writing another book called We Who Wrestle with God, and it's really shaping up. I really understand the narrative structure of the story now, and a big part of the narrative of the new book is the fact that there are multiple lines of evidence converging on the scientific and theological and philosophical front, all simultaneously, I would say on the AI front too, that indicate, I would say incontrovertibly, which is a very strong word, incontrovertibly, that we see the world through a story, that we have to. We don't see the world through a set of facts, and we don't see the world through a rational framework. We see the world through a structure that, when you describe, constitutes a story. And this makes a certain amount of intuitive sense if you think about it for a moment or two, because you might ask yourself, well, why in the world do we find stories so compelling? Right? It's a real peculiarity that you might not pay to come and see a lecture, although you are doing that tonight, but you will definitely pay to go see a story. Right? You'll line up to do that voluntarily, and children love stories, and they learn through stories, and we're compelled by stories, and we like to hear someone tell an interesting story, and if we tell an interesting story to someone else, it engages them, and we wouldn't have that proclivity, and you can dispense of that and call it trivial and think about it only as the pursuit of shallow entertainment, but that's a very demeaning manner of construing something so fundamental. And it makes more sense to think that, well, maybe stories are so important to us because we do literally encounter the world through a story. And I think that's true. And one of the stories we're told now is that the story of the world is one of power and oppression. And that's a very interesting story because in some sense it's true, right? We know that our institutions can become corrupt. We know that our relationships can become corrupt at the personal level. We know that our relationship with ourselves can become corrupt. And so the story of corruption is an interesting and compelling story. But it's one thing to say that the world is constituted the way it is because it's intrinsically corrupt and that human beings are only motivated by the pursuit of power. And it's another thing to say, no, that's what happens when the real story goes wrong. And then you can think about that practically and personally. You think, well, look, if your marriage is going well, is it predicated on power or is it predicated on mutual agreement? And if your relationship with your children is going well, is it predicated on you compelling them and forcing them, or is it predicated on mutually acceptable voluntary cooperation? And you'd say the same thing about your friendships, because if they're based on power, you don't have any friends. And you must say the same thing about your business relationships. If you compel your customers, if you use deception and force to manipulate them, then that's pathological and corrupt and not the basis of the proper structure of an enterprise or a company. There has to be an element of voluntarism that's associated with those social contracts, or they're corrupt. And so you could say it's a perfectly reasonable story. The story of power is a perfectly reasonable story if you're talking about how the social enterprise and the psychological enterprise become corrupt. But that's not the same thing at all as saying that's the fundamental motivation of humankind, that the only proper story that describes our history is one of exploitation and power. The only proper story that describes the fundamental motivation for a marriage is one of oppression and patriarchal tyranny. And that also governs our economic relationships and our relationships with our children. It's like that's a very, very cynical and nihilistic viewpoint. And I also think that it's wrong. And so one question is, if we see the world through a story, necessarily so, then it begs the question, well, what's the appropriate story? And one answer to that is not the story that power rules. Definitely not that story. And then you might say, well, what is the proper force that rules if it's not the force of power? And, well, that's what my next book is about. And I've come to understand, too, that our religious enterprise, in the most fundamental sense, is an attempt to make explicit the nature of the implicit story through which we see the world. And that so if we're operating in the world in a manner that's sustainable and productive and generous and reciprocal and playful, then we're characterized by a certain mode of apprehension and action. And we try to capture that so that we can understand it and communicate it and transfer it to our children. And the religious enterprise is precisely, it's the deepest part of the literary enterprise. And the literary enterprise is the attempt to capture the stories that guide us. That's a good way of thinking about it. And so my next book, which is We Who Wrestle with God, is an attempt to describe the manner in which across centuries or even millennia, we attempted to capture and make explicit the stories that must and should guide us. And so I'm very excited about that because, well, I'm excited about it partly because I think it's true. I think that's the most exciting part of it, is that it really does look like there is no other way of apprehending the world than through a narrative framework. And if that's true, then it's true that we see the world through a story and that we act out a story. I knew this because I learned this from Carl Jung decades ago. He said that every person acts out a myth, consciously or unconsciously. And that one of the things you need to do in your life is to understand what story possesses you. Because it might not be a story that you want to act out. Maybe it's a tragedy. And you see people who stumble through life in the most tragic and awful of manners. And you think, well, what possesses them? And the answer is, well, it's a myth of destruction. It's something like that. It's a myth of nihilism, or it's a myth of maternal dependence, or it's a myth of dominance by power. It's something like that. And it demolishes their life. And so then you ask yourself that question. It's like, what story guides you? Well, that's one question. What story guides me? And then another question is, what story should guide me? And there isn't a more fundamental question than that. That is the fundamental religious question. And so all of that's explored in this new book and has been occupying my thought to a tremendous degree while conducting these lectures and trying to sort this through. And it's really quite, I talked to a man named Carl Friston the other day, did a podcast with him, and he is possibly the world's foremost neuroscientist, certainly one of the most cited, and citation count among scientists is an estimate of their impact in the broader social community. The more people that refer to your work, the more influential you are, and hypothetically, the more fundamental and basic your work. And it's a pretty good measure. And I asked Friston straight out, whether or not he thought that our units of perception, so maybe even the fact that I can see this box in front of me as a speaker, if that unit of perception itself, which looks like the perception of an object, was in fact something more akin to a micro story, and his answer to that was yes. He believed that our perception, all the way down to the level of object perception, it's irreducibly narrative in the final analysis. And that what we think we see as objects are actually elements that guide us as we create our stories. Even the things we see, you see what I mean? It's not just what you act out or what you think or what you can tell as a story, but the very things that you see as self-evident objects are actually props in your play. That's the most appropriate way of thinking about it. And that's, if that's true, that's really something. That if that's true, and it seems to be, because as I said, the evidence is converging from multiple disciplines simultaneously and very, very rapidly. If that's true, it's an absolute revolution, because we've never really understood before, not incontrovertibly, we've never understood before in Western intellectual history that the lens through which we see the world has a narrative structure. And as I said, then those other questions immediately fall forwards, like, well, if we see the world through a narrative, well, here's another way of thinking about it. Maybe you don't see the world through a single narrative. You see the world through multiple narratives, so that's a polytheistic perspective. Well, what's the consequence of that? Well, you're confused. That's the consequence. And what's the consequence of confusion? And this is something I talked with Friston about in detail. Well, anxiety is an index of confusion. So the more fragmented your narrative, which means the more directions you're going at the same time, the more you're working at counter-purpose to yourself, the more your vision isn't united, the more your actions are disparate and disjointed, not only are you, the more anxious you are. And so that doesn't seem like a good thing. It's also the case that we experience positive emotion in relationship to a united narrative goal. So if you're approaching something that you regard as important and vital and unified, right, which would be equivalent to being possessed by something in your life that was meaningful, that's when you experience positive emotion. So now we know too that if you inhabit a narrative that isn't oriented towards something transcendent and unified, and that's fragmentary and disjointed, that you're doomed to be anxious and hopeless. Because anxiety and hopelessness are actually markers for the presence of a narrative that's disjointed. And that also accounts to some degree for the human tendency towards a monotheism, because we want to unite our perceptions and our actions, not only within ourselves so that we're integrated and have hope as we move towards a united future, but so that we can unite with other people. Because if we don't occupy the same narrative space, then we can't understand each other. You know, when you go to a movie, when you come to a theater like this, we can all sit here in peace and harmony because we're all doing the same thing, right? We've all come to an a priori decision that the appropriate thing to do in this space is to sit eyes front and focus on the event that's lit. And that's why we can sit here in peace and we can move through the next few hours united. It's because we're acting out the same piece of a narrative. And you might say, well, piece of what narrative? And my wife and I have found these events to be very positive. What's the narrative that we're acting out? Well, we're here to explore mutually, we're here to communicate, and hopefully we're here to make things better. And because we're all doing that at the same time, as you can tell, because we're all doing exactly the same thing and seeing things the same way, that's the basis for the harmony that enables us to be united in this space of 6,000 strangers. And so the unified narrative is not only the precondition for psychological stability in the subjective sense, right? You need to be unified in your narrative so you're not anxious and so you're not hopeless. But it's also vital in the social sense, because unless we all occupy a unified narrative, then we're fractious, anxious, hopeless, and confused. And it seems to me, and I'll close this part of the evening with this, it seems to me that all of those propositions have become scientifically incontrovertible. So these aren't only insights that are emerging, let's say, from the analysis of literature, the analysis of theology. It's like, no, things are snapping together from the material domain and from the literary domain simultaneously. And that's ridiculously exciting, because it points to the fact that there is a uniting truth that flows through the scientific endeavor and from the bottom up in some sense, and from the theological endeavor from the top down, and they meet in the middle. And where they meet, the truth is where they meet. And it would really be something if that was the case, and it seems that it might be the case. And so, who would have guessed that? So, well, thank you all. Yeah, so those are a couple of things that are coming down the pipe. So the Exodus seminar will launch on November 25th. I also did a series of documentaries. I did one with Jonathan Pajot in Jerusalem. We walked the Via Dolorosa, which are the 12 Stations of the Cross, and then went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the first real Christian church founded on the putative place of the crucifixion. And so that's one documentary. I did a documentary on the Jewish holy sites with Ben Shapiro. That's another one coming out. Yeah, that was something. Yeah, because the Israelis have dug up a tremendous amount of the old city of David and underneath Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and so that's really something to see. And Shapiro is extremely bright, as most of you know, and it was very fun to talk about these things with him. And I went to Athens with another scholar, and we looked at the emergence of the idea of the logos from the Greek perspective, right? So, there was a logos idea that the Greeks developed, which was something like the intrinsic meaningfulness of the, you might say, of the material world. It's a bit more complicated than that, but it was more of a materialist. It was more of a materialist view, that there's an intrinsic order in reality itself that makes itself manifest if you attend to it properly. Belief in that is like a precondition for the scientific endeavor, right? Because you have to believe that the cosmos has a rationally ordered basis in order to even bother exploring it. Because if it was incomprehensible a priori, why would you bother investigating it? You also have to believe that the investigation of the material world would be redemptive in some sense, right? That if you learn about the world, that will make things better for you and everyone else. Those are articles of faith, right? And not factual derivatives. And the Greeks developed those ideas to a tremendous degree, and then that, on top of that, was overlaid this Judeo-Christian idea of the logos as a personality or a spirit that you acted out. And so we spent a lot of time in Athens discussing the conjunction of those two sets of ideas, and really Western civilization is predicated on the conjunction of those two sets of ideas, that there's an ordered logos of spirit that meets the ordered logos of world, and that that redemptive truth in some sense is to be found in the conjunction of those two things. And so, which also seems to be true. And so that's, all of those documentaries are coming out in the next few months, and there's more content as well. And then when I finish the Exodus seminar in January, then I'm going to do a series of public lectures on Exodus like I did on Genesis. And I hope to do that sometime in the middle part of next year. And so all of those things, assuming we all last that long, which I wish was funny, but under the current circumstances isn't so funny. All of that's planned for the upcoming year. So I'm all excited about that, and I hope it proves to be real helpful. All right.
So here's a question. What are your thoughts on Bitcoin and technology pushing for decentralization? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I like the idea of decentralized, I wouldn't say power, because again, I think that's the wrong way of construing the situation, because as soon as you think about decentralized power, then you've fallen into the clutches of those who think that power is the fundamental motivation. I really do think it's an unbelievably pathological presupposition, because what it presupposes is that, well, if everyone had their own choice, what they would choose is to compel others to do their will. And I don't believe that's true. I mean, I think it's true under some circumstances, but as I said before, I think that's only true when things degenerate. Because I don't think that we find our highest meaning in the compulsion of others to do our will. And I don't believe that we can find the meaning that sustains us in life by forcing others to grant our short-term wishes. I think that's an extraordinarily counterproductive way to live. And I think that the fact that psychopaths fail is evidence for that. Right? Psychopaths are people who have the proclivity to use instrumental compulsion on others. For a psychopath, you're the source of whatever gratification can be extracted in the short term. And that looks like it's a more effective evolutionary strategy than laying at home semi-conscious in your bed, but it's certainly not effective enough so that it's the dominant human strategy, not by any stretch of the imagination. It's not even the dominant chimpanzee strategy. And so it isn't the distribution of power that's the advantage to decentralization. It's the distribution of destiny and responsibility. Now, I'll tell you one other thing about the story in Exodus, because there's another segment of that story that's extremely interesting. So when the Israelites are out in the desert, remember they've been slaves forever, and so they don't know how to organize themselves. They're fighting like mad. They have no idea how to mediate their own conflicts. And you see this in the modern world constantly, especially among people who are married, but within families as well. People are very bad at negotiating mediation. They have no idea how to do it. Why that is very complicated, but I think it's partly the desert and tyranny problem. Is it's hard to communicate with your partner, because if it turns out that you're wrong, which you often are, probably usually, and it means you have to give up something you believe to be true, and which wasn't, which is a bit of the tyrannical you, and then when you give that up, then you have to be in the desert for a while, and that's annoying. And so it's much easier just to tell your, yeah, everyone laughs because you all know that's absolutely true. Yeah, and that's partly why you have to be willing to die in order to come back to life too, right? Because you have to let go of those parts of you that are dead, and or that should be dead, and then those parts have to die. And that's not nothing. And those parts fight to stay alive. And so Moses is out in the desert with the Israelites, and they're fighting away with each other, and they don't know how to negotiate, they don't know how to mediate their disputes, and so they come to Moses and they say, look, we're fighting all the time here. Do you want to tell us what to do? Do you want to judge us? And Moses says, yeah, I guess, okay. And so then he sets himself up as judge, and he judges the Israelites for like years, from morning till late at night. And his father-in-law, Jethro, shows up. And he's a figure that represents the archetype of the moral stranger. So he can see the enslaved Israelites squabbling away in the desert, and he can see Moses set himself up above them, and he can see that that's not so good. And so he goes to Moses and he says something like, you have to stop doing this. And Moses says, why? And Jethro says, well, first of all, it's too much responsibility. Nobody can do what you're doing and stay together. You're going to degenerate mentally and physically. It's too much burden. But worse, arguably, you're depriving your people of the responsibility of their own destiny. You're depriving them of the adventure of their life. You're depriving them of the necessity of their adventure. And you're setting yourself up as another Pharaoh. Because you can imagine the pharaonic situation, the tyrannical situation. It's like the Tower of Babel. There's a lot of disenchanted, fractionated individuals, and there's a tyrant. And that's all the structure there is. And that's just not any good. And all these disaffected individuals have no responsibility, and so all the responsibility is taken up by the tyrannical force, and then you have a huge gap between the tyrant and the disaffected individuals, and it's just a recipe for tyranny and slavery. It's a recipe for disaster. And so what Jethro says to Moses is, he says something like, you have to build an intermediary hierarchy, although those aren't the words that are used. And it turns out that we build those intermediary hierarchies in our own neural networks in an attempt to process the world properly. So this looks like a universal principle of proper apprehension and action. There has to be intermediary levels of processing. And so what Jethro tells Moses is, divide the Israelites into groups of 10 and have each 10 propose a leader. And then take the leaders and group them, and you have the leaders elect another leader, and then do that all the way up to groups of 10,000, and then have all the decisions made at as local a level as possible. And if the local hierarchies can't handle it, then you can make the final judgment. Otherwise, leave the people to their own devices, because they need the responsibility. And if you take on all that abdicated responsibility and destiny, then you'll just be another Pharaoh. And that's the principle of subsidiarity. That's the technical term. And the principle of subsidiarity is that decisions are best made at the lowest and most local level possible. And that looks like a universal principle. And Jonathan Pageau, who some of you know about, told me, yes, he's very smart, Jonathan Pageau. He told me in the Exodus seminar that that was the archetypal pattern for the idea of Mount Sinai. It's the archetypal pattern for the notion of proper governance. A distributed system of responsibility as opposed to absolute slavery. And it's opposed to absolute slavery, it's opposed to absolute tyranny, and it's also opposed to freedom without bounds. As one of the other things that happens in Exodus is when God tells Moses to tell the Pharaoh to let his people go, which is what you always hear, it's a famous line, let my people go. That's not what God tells Moses to tell the Pharaoh. He says, let my people go so they may serve me in the wilderness. That's a whole different idea, because what it does is juxtapose against slavery ordered freedom, not borderless and boundless freedom. Because borderless and boundless freedom is just chaos, whereas ordered freedom is freedom according to a set of appropriate principles. And then the question is, well, what are the principles? And that's the same question as what is the story that should guide you? In any case, the proper model of governance is something like a hierarchy of responsibility. And so one of the things that Tammy and I have been endeavoring to do as we travel from city to city, and I suppose what I'm doing right now, is to remind all of you of one thing, I suppose. If you abdicate your civic responsibility, then power-mad tyrants will vacuum it up and use it against you. Because someone's going to take that responsibility. And if it's not you, then it's going to be someone who wants to take that from you. And so one of the things that's happening in our society Now, I've been thinking this through with regard to such things as church attendance, because I've heard all the arguments about why you shouldn't attend church, and it's not like I've been a great attender of churches myself, by the way. And I've come to the conclusion that that attitude, regardless of its rationale, is wrong. Because it may be the case that the churches are corrupt and misguided. But that's also the case for you, by the way. And if they are corrupt and misguided, then they could probably use some help. And if you're not corrupt and misguided, then you could help. And if you are corrupt and misguided, well, maybe the church could help you. And then you have a reciprocal relationship, And so you may say, well, I'm going to abandon all that. But then the question is, well, what are you abandoning it to? And if the answer is, well, when you abandon all that, let's say your devotion to a tradition of faith, you abandon your responsibility to tradition and the past, you abandon your responsibility to the ordered principles that allow us to properly be free, and you abandon it to what? And the answer is, well, you abandon it to chaos and to tyrants. And that just doesn't seem like a very good alternative. And one of the things that's also seemed to happen as people who have abdicated their responsibility in relationship to the religious quest is that they have also tended to abandon their civic duties. And so all of our civic institutions, political parties and businessmen's clubs and sports clubs and all of those and marriages, by the way, and families, they're all disintegrating. And the problem with that is we all end up atomized and disparate, and then all that abdicated responsibility goes to the tyrants. And that's a very bad idea. And it's happened time and time again. You know, it's encapsulated in the kinds of stories that we've been talking about tonight. Part of the reason that Bitcoin is attractive to people, you see, there was a point to all that. Part of the reason that Bitcoin is attractive to people is because we all have the sense right now, and that's certainly part of the reason why so many of you are here tonight, is that there's a little bit too much tyranny going on. And that's the collusion of large-scale enterprises at the top. And so there are attempts to push back on that by developing decentralized systems. And the idea that we could develop a decentralized standard of universal value, which is what money is very interesting idea. I've done what I could to think through the Bitcoin proposition, and it makes sense, but that doesn't mean it's right. You know, I went to a Bitcoin conference a while back, and it was full of Bitcoin enthusiasts, and of course all they wanted to hear was enthusiastic things about Bitcoin, and fair enough, you know, because it's not like I'm a great fan of the fiat currency that allows governments to print money and inflate away value, because that punishes people who are sensible and who make the proper sacrifices. It's inflationary, as you're all seeing right now. It's a very bad idea. And to give the centralizers that power, I think it's not a good idea. Now, that doesn't mean that Bitcoin is the right solution. And part of the problem with introducing a radical solution like Bitcoin, and it's radical because it would change the way we undertake all our trade, is that it probably won't do just the things you think it will do, right? Because when you change a system that is so complex you don't understand it, like when you disrupt the supply chain to hypothetically control COVID, all sorts of things happen that you don't expect, which is what conservatives always remind liberals. It's like, don't be thinking that your revolutionary change is only going to bring about the positive things that you envision, because you don't know what you're mucking about with. And so we could, in principle, and this seems to be what's happening, is allow a variety of currencies to battle with one another on the competitive landscape. And we sort of have that internationally because every currency has to trade against every other currency. And now we've added cryptocurrency to that mix. And that seems to me to be a good experimental option. And maybe Bitcoin will aggregate to itself the value that its adherents claim. But that remains to be seen, and it doesn't mean it's a pathway without pitfalls, right? Because we imagine Bitcoin was successful and all of a sudden we never had any control over, we really never were able to exercise control over our monetary system again. Because that's what it would mean, because it really is decentralized. And if Bitcoin and the blockchain technology truly obtained the upper hand, we would have put our economic system outside of the political domain. Now, you can make a case that maybe that would be an okay thing, right? Because you don't want the standard of value subordinate to political machination. But it also means that it's no longer subordinate to the collective will, the collective express will of the people as manifested in the electoral process. And we don't know if that would be a good thing. And it's a hell of an experiment to run, because you won't know the outcome until you can't alter the results of the experiment. So, you know, I have some investment in Bitcoin because I'm curious about it, and it's a compelling idea. It's a genius idea, but that doesn't mean that it's destined for success. So I'm pro-decentralization. I like the idea that mendacious, short-term oriented, narcissistic, power-mad politicians can't inflate the currency and steal value from people to fund their idiot pet projects. But But, you know, revolutionary changes usually bring about radically unintended consequences. So, and I think that's why the marketplace is still toying with Bitcoin, you know, instead of rushing headlong into its embrace, let's say. So that's what I think about Bitcoin.
And now for something completely different. Where do you see the future of gender/trans ideology going?
You like that one, do you? Okay, well, I think I'll address that in 3 ways. So the first is, there's a very odd presupposition driving the claim that subjective identity is paramount. So let's assume that the transgender brouhaha is a manifestation of a more fundamental issue. So one of the things Carl Jung said 4, maybe 6 decades ago was that the logical conclusion of the Protestant Revolution would be that everyone would become their own church. And so what you see, because Protestantism divorces itself from hierarchical control, it tends to fractionate. There's many, many Protestant denominations. And you might ask yourself, well, what's the ultimate limit of that? And the ultimate limit of that would be, well, each person is their own church. And then you might ask, well, does that mean that each person is now their own God? And the answer to that seems to be, well, that's the claim. And why would I say that? Well, Moses in the desert asks God to reveal his name. And God says something like, I am that I am, or I will be what I will be, or I am what I always have been. It's all of those things at once. And it's sort of like the statement of being itself. But I am that I am is a good summary of that name. And that's the subjective identity claim. It's the claim that my sense, whatever that is, my felt sense of who I am is to reign as unquestioned truth. And I'm ashamed of my entire discipline for allowing that proposition to be put forth without challenge, because it's utterly preposterous. And it's preposterous for a variety of reasons. It's preposterous, number one, because you do not have complete access to yourself. If you did, you'd know everything. You're a mystery to yourself. And so the idea that you understand your identity thoroughly and finally is ridiculous, obviously. You're not a mystery to yourself? Really? Can you even tell yourself what to do and then do it? And the answer is, well, no. And do you only say the things you think you should say? No. Are you disobedient to yourself constantly? Yes. Do you confuse yourself more than anyone else ever confuses you? So, like, who are you to say who you are? And, well, but, and then... And that doesn't even begin to touch the fact that you're also mutable, and who you are tomorrow might be quite different than who you are today, and hopefully that would be the case if you're walking uphill, you know, and trying to change in a positive way. And so that's a real problem, the idea that, and then on ethical grounds, it's actually unethical for a psychologist to take your word for it. And I mean this technically. One of the things that psychologists have been very, very good at is specifying accurate measurement. And there are rules. So one rule is, to measure something, you have to use multiple techniques of measurement that are qualitatively distinct, and they all have to point in the same direction. And so if you come to me and you make a claim about your identity, I think I'm such a bad person that my life, that it would be better if I was dead. That's what a depressed person might tell you. And then they might say, and here's all the evidence for that. And if you listen to them, you think, well, that's pretty compelling evidence. You've done a lot of, I mean, really, look, lots of times people are depressed, not always, but lots of times people are depressed because they've actually done terrible things. Sometimes people are depressed because they blow the minor things they've done out of proportion. But you can certainly do terrible things enough so that you're doubtful about whether it's ethical for you to remain alive. Now, am I just supposed to take you at your word? Or am I supposed to do some investigation and find out, well, maybe you're clinically depressed, or maybe there's something wrong with you physically. You're ill in some sense. Or maybe there's other ways of looking at the situation. The whole therapeutic endeavor is an investigation into identity. And as soon as it becomes legally mandatory for me as a therapist to do nothing but verify your identity claims, not only am I violating the fundamental ethical precepts of my discipline, I'm eradicating the entire therapeutic process. Because the whole process is about identity. Who are you? Who were you? Who are you? And who are you going to become? And that's what's on the table in psychotherapy. And if you want to go to a therapist and have your identity stamped, then that's not therapy. And if you want to go to your wife or your husband or your neighbor and say, I am that I am, and what I say goes, then that's not a marriage or love between parent and child, and it's certainly not a friendship. And that brings us to the third part of the identity issue. It's like identity is negotiated unless you're 2 years old. And I actually mean this technically, because 2-year-olds are solipsistic and egocentric. And the reason for that is that it's taken them 2 years just to integrate their internal motivational and emotional states so that they can more or less orient themselves from moment to moment. They don't have much of a medium to long-term orientation. And so a 2-year-old can walk and has begun to talk and can communicate, but a 2-year-old cannot inhabit a space of shared identity. Not very well. And so 2-year-olds can't play with each other. So if you have 2-year-olds together, you might think, well, they're playing together. But if you watch them carefully, you find out they're not. They're each playing a separate game. And Jean Piaget, like some married couples, by the way. So Jean Piaget, who was the first psychologist to really detail this out, noted that it wasn't until children hit about the age of 3 that they learned how to inhabit a shared narrative. And that meant that they could negotiate their identity. So let's think through what that means. So imagine you have a little boy of 3 and a little girl of 3 or 4, and they decide to play house. Well, they set up the dramatic forum. So one child will invite the other child to play. And they'll say something like a little stage director, they'll say, well, do you want to play house? And kids are very good at this. When Tammy and I used to take our kids to the beach at Cape Ann, just outside of Boston, we used to go there sometime in the fall, and sometimes in the winter there'd be no one else around, and sometimes it was too cold for them to go into the water. And one of the things I used to do was inscribe a house, a schematic of a house on the sand, little rooms, and this was the kitchen and this was the bedrooms, and then the kids would just go in there and it'd be a house, and the way they'd play for half an hour or so, and which is a remarkable feat of imagination. But even more remarkable was the fact that they could play together. And so a boy who knows how to play or a girl who knows how to play will ask the other child or children, will propose a game, which is basically the proposal of a system of principles that would govern their joint interactions for some span of time. And it has to be engaged in voluntarily, right? So that's the spirit of play. Would you like to play house? All of that's going on underneath that utterance. And the girl might say yes, and then they'll negotiate. I'll be the daddy, and you can be the mom. If there's some other kids there, one of them might be the cat, and one of them might be the daughter, and they all have to agree to their roles, or it's not a very fun game, which is another thing to think about when you're married. And then you think, well, what are they doing exactly? Well, it's very sophisticated what they're doing. So what the boy does when he acts out the father. So the idea of father is an abstraction, right? Because there's many fathers, and all the fathers are different, but there's something common about all the different fathers that enables us to have the word father. And that commonality across fathers is the spirit of the father. And what the child does is attempt to emulate the spirit of the father while playing house. And so he's gathered information about what it means to be a father by watching his father, if he has one, across repeated interactions, and by listening to stories about fathers, and by watching movies about fathers, and by hoovering up all the information he possibly can about what it means to be a father, extracting out the commonality, and then embodying that. And then the girl is doing the same thing on the maternal side, and then both of them are doing that, which is absolutely mind-boggling, in a manner that enables those two abstracted roles to occupy the same space in a fun manner. And if you don't think that's difficult, then I would refer you once again to your own marriage, and you can just think about how difficult that is. And that's what a child's doing at the age of 3, and it's something. And that is not the insistence on subjective identity, because what the child has to do, if he wants or she wants the game to continue, is to negotiate the subjective identity in good faith, right? Because if it isn't being negotiated in good faith, which means it's malleable and will shift according to the demands of the situation, then it's no fun and the game collapses. And so the idea that identity is subjectively defined and that others can be compelled to accept that is absurd ethically from a psychological perspective. It's preposterous developmentally. It's inappropriate politically. It's narcissistic beyond comprehension. It's immature and it's tyrannical. And it's also not sustainable. You know, when you're talking to your wife and listening, which I would recommend doing both of those now and then, and vice versa, what you're both doing is negotiating your identity. Your identity as husband and wife, and your joint identity as married couple. And there has to be a tremendous amount of transformational dialogue to keep those two identities and that joint identity alive and thriving. And if it's my way or the highway, well, then good luck with your marriage. And if it's my subjective identity rules, well, good luck with your friends. You have to be able to dance, you know. That's why we dance with each other, by the way. It's to see if we can negotiate a shared identity on the dance floor without falling prey to awkwardness or sexual demand too precipitously, to see if the other person can play, to see if you can negotiate a transforming identity at the most embodied level possible. And so the idea that your subjective identity rules by fiat, it's so immature that it's almost incomprehensible. It's also led me to wonder if part of the reason that's happening is that we've interfered with the ability of our children to play so catastrophically that they're now playing like 2-year-olds when they're 18. I really mean that. Because it looks to me like this radical experimentation with gender identity that's taking place so frenetically in late adolescence, in the universities, let's say, might be a consequence of catastrophically delayed childhood pretend play. And you might ask, well, why is that delayed? Well, screens might have something to do with it, right? Is that the kids are looking at screens and not playing. So I see the trans phenomena just as a subset of that. It's like it's just another subjective identity claim, and it's invalid on the face of it because you don't get to establish your identity by fiat, not if you want anyone to play with you. And so it's a non-starter. And I think it's absolutely reprehensible that the medical, psychiatric, and psychological communities have kowtowed to this notion that subjectively defined identity rules, because that's not how the game works. I would also say And here's the problem with, and I knew this when I objected to the legislation in Canada that made use of these manufactured pronouns mandatory. I thought, the problem with that is if I don't want to interact with someone who demands to be interacted with in that way, in a manner that is not going to be good for them in the medium to long run, because I don't think that's ethical. And so someone might say, well, you use my pronouns, and I think, well, you think that's good for you, but I don't. And then you might say, well, who am I to decide? It's like, well, I get to decide how I treat you. That's how the world works. Now, you may resist that, and you have the right to do so, but it's going to be a negotiation unless we want to stop negotiating, in which case one of us is a slave and one of us is a tyrant. And it's not likely that it's going to be me that's going to be the slave, by the way. So the bottom line here is something like, if you're unwilling to negotiate your identity, then no one's going to play with you. Now, this does happen to children. So there are 2-year-olds who are sufficiently aggressive and unsocialized enough so they don't make that transition to the joint negotiation of identity around the age of 3. And they continue using the same strategies that they used at 2. And what happens to those children is the other children don't play with them. And then the other children go off and play with each other, and they scaffold their mutual development, and they start to accelerate towards maturity. But the kids who are alienated because they don't know how to play, because they insist upon the primacy of their subjective identity, they get put off in little child jail, and they stay immature and aggressive permanently. And once that's instantiated by about the age of 5, it's almost impossible to reverse. And so if you don't have the wherewithal to negotiate your identity socially, you are alienating yourself and isolating yourself and dooming yourself to fragmented and counterproductive isolation and misery. And I don't see that playing along with that is an ethical thing to do. And so you might say to me, you have to treat me exactly the way I tell you to. And my response to that is, it doesn't seem to me that that's in your best interest in the medium to long run. And as a professional psychologist, I'm not inclined to abide by that dictate if it's brought about as a consequence of compulsion. Period. It's the compulsion that's the problem, fundamentally. You know, I'll just close with this. Look, human identity is very, very complex. So there are 2 biological sexes, but there are a multitude of temperaments on top of that. And the biological sex has a biological basis. And why would I say that? The answer is, well, you need opposition of sex to reproduce. Does everybody agree on that? I mean, if not, you're not going to have children, by the way. Because if you don't notice that and act it out, then you're not going to reproduce. In case any of you were wondering why you're not reproducing, that's why. And obviously that has a biological basis and has a cultural basis, but the reproductive element is biological, and it's obviously of crucial importance. On top of that is a layer of temperament. And temperament has at least 5 dimensions, and 5 dimensions is that defines a very large space. And there are a lot of feminine men, and there are a lot of masculine women, and that can make for a kind of awkwardness of match between, say, reproductive role and temperamental identity. Now, that's kind of poorly conceptualized as gender. I don't think there's any such thing as gender. It's a badly conceptualized term, but there is variability in temperament. And so there are feminine men and masculine women. And juxtaposing the biological role with the temperament can be more difficult for those people, and it's even more difficult if they're also creative. You know, when I was teaching at Harvard, I did a study with a fellow professor of mine when piercing and wild hair dyeing first became popular. Piercing, tattooing, and wild hair dyeing, that was in the early 90s. Before that, piercing and tattooing in particular was only something practiced by deviant subcultures, criminals and circus types and those sorts of people. Well, that's exactly right. I mean, there were magazines devoted to that sort of thing. I knew something about the subculture, and then it started to become trendy. And one of the things I wondered along with my colleagues was the rising incidence of piercing and tattooing a marker for psychopathology? Like, was this a symptom of mental disorder? So we did a study to find out. And what we found out was, no, it wasn't. The people who were likely to pierce and tattoo at that point were people who were very high in trait openness. And openness is the creativity dimension. And creative people are mutable in their identity. That's sort of what defines creative. And so imagine that you're a feminine man and you're creative. Well, you're going to have a difficult time adjusting your temperament to your biological role. But that doesn't mean that the first conclusion you should jump to is that you were born in the wrong body and you should surgically mutilate and sterilize yourself. Now, I'll close with this, because this is still a contentious topic. So some of you may know, and some of you may not, that the clinic in the United Kingdom that did the bulk of the gender reassignment surgical interventions over the last decades was recently closed by the UK government. Now, and the reason it was closed was because the people of Great Britain, by and large, decided that what was happening there did not constitute valid medical practice, to say the least. And now, there were 19,000 surgical procedures carried out at the Tavistock. 1,000 of those people have now launched lawsuits against the Tavistock for medical malpractice. So that's what's happening across the Atlantic, where people have decided to reevaluate their stance on the claim that subjective feeling should be sufficient evidence to warrant radical surgical intervention and sterilization. And I'm siding pretty firmly with the people in the UK on that front. So, and I'll close with one piece of evidence. So there's a man in Toronto, a very good researcher, whose name unfortunately escapes me at the moment. He worked for
Ken Zucker.
For CAMH, what was his name?
Zucker? Ken
Zucker, right, thanks Tim. And Zucker was the world's foremost authority on gender dysphoria prior to its explosion into the domain of cultural fad. And he was the editor of the best scientific journal concentrating on such matters. And he ran the gender dysphoria clinic at CAMH, which is the major mental hospital in Toronto. And he did long-term follow-up studies of kids who had gender dysphoria. And so those were often feminine boys who were uncomfortable being boys, or masculine girls who were uncomfortable being girls. And he was curious about what should be done with them. And the long-term follow-up studies indicated, first of all, that a large proportion of them developed into people who were homosexual in their primary sexual orientation. About 80%, if I remember correctly. But 90% of them settled into their biological bodies, let's say, as if there's any other kind, and by the time they were 18 or 19. So Zucker's guidelines were, leave them the hell alone, which is a good medical guideline, right? It's first, do no harm. Just don't interfere when you don't know what you're doing. And 90% of the kids will settle into their identities. but 80% of them will be interested in same-sex partners. And so one of the perverse things that's happened, if that data is correct, and there's no reason to assume it's not, because the scientists who generated it were as unbiased as people ever are when they're evaluating such things. Zucker didn't have a political bone in his body. He was just a straight-up clinician. And they just hounded him out of his job, by the way, destroyed his reputation, demolished his life. He got a bit of legal revenge, but he was very much tarred and feathered for his care and knowledge. It turns out that the vast majority of the kids being transitioned are gay. That doesn't seem to be a huge step forward for the gay community. It looks like they were better off under the brutal domination of the heterosexuals than under the tender mercies of the trans activists. Man, you can think about that for yourself. So that's what I think about the trans issue.
So there's some high school students here. And there's some parents who brought their high school students. So there's a couple of
voluntarily, I hope.
Well, or the kids brought their parents. I'm not sure which.
Maybe.
But what advice would you have for 18 and 19-year-old who feels that college isn't for them?
Well, it's possible that college isn't for you. You know, I mean, there's other things you can do that are productive. If you're wondering, if you're a high school student and you're wondering if college is for you, one of the things I would recommend is choose as an alternative something equally or more difficult. And I would say to all of you, if you're ever facing a decision in your life, this is kind of a good rule of thumb, because you always have to ask yourself, is this not right for me, or am I just useless and lazy? And looking for an easy way out, right? Because some people are more prone to that than others. If you're not very conscientious, for example, you're going to be more prone to that sort of thing. But it's good to keep yourself in check. And so maybe you're not doing very well in your job, and you think, well, I should either do a better job at my job, or maybe I should find a new job. And it's hard to do better at your job. And so then you might wonder if your decision to find a new job is just an escape. But if the rule is you'll only escape to something equally or more difficult, or more challenging, let's say, then you kind of check yourself against your own temptation. And that's a useful thing to do. And so I would say, well, if you're a high school kid and you don't want to go to college because you don't think it's for you, well, fair enough. Do you have a better plan? And if the answer is no, well, that's not a very good plan, right? It's college or nothing. Well, go to college then, because nothing is a really bad plan. And the most miserable 40-year-olds that I dealt with in my clinical practice were pursuing exactly the same nothing at 40 they were pursuing at 20, except they were now 40. And it's just not that cute when you're 40. So it's not that cute when you're 20, really, but it's really not that cute when you're 40. And so if you don't want to go to college, you should do something else. And there's lots of other things to do. You can go to trade school, or you could go to a tech boot camp, or you could go into the military, or you could go get a job, or you could pursue something creative, or you could generate an enterprise, or you could do volunteer work. It's like you want to have a vision that justifies your decision not to go to college. And you know, you could try college for a year or a semester and see how it goes. And then I would also say, even though I am somewhat and justifiably cynical about higher institutes of higher education, when I went to college and university, particularly university, because the college I went to, which was a small college, was a very good college, and most of the professors there really wanted to teach, and I learned a lot there. But at university, it was much more hit and miss. A fairly high proportion of the classes were abysmally bad. They were taught by people who had no business whatsoever teaching anything to anyone. Even though they might have been credible researchers, they were terrible communicators. And that was at least one class out of 4. And then another, at least 1 out of 4, wasn't good for other reasons. So even when the universities weren't corrupted to the degree they are now, if you wanted to go to university and get a good education, that was sort of on you. You know, you had to pick and choose between the professors. You had to use your head to find the elements of value. And I think that in most educational institutions you can still do that, although it's not the case that you can do that at all of them. And it's increasingly less likely that that's the case in the humanities, I would say. But I'm not so cynical that I believe it's impossible to go to the typical higher education institute and be careful and learn. Because there's always the library too, you know, and the library is full of books, and books are written by great people, and you can go read the books written by great people, which is what you should be doing when you go to college anyways, or going to university, and you can still do that. And the other advantage to going to college is that you buy an identity, you know, because you can say to people when they say, well, what are you doing? Which is sort of like saying, who are you? You can say, I'm a student. And that gives you an identity. And student means I'm someone who's made the sacrifices necessary to allow myself the freedom to determine who I want to be through a period of study extending over about 4 years. And it's not nothing to buy that identity, right? And to share it with other people. It gives you a walled garden to inhabit while you sort yourself out. And you deprive yourself of that at your peril. So if you don't want to go to college, then do something as good or better. And if you can't, then go to college. Don't sit around and do nothing. That's a very big mistake.
I'm an atheist, but I joined a church for the community. What do I tell my toddlers when they grow up?
Well, I just tell them that, probably. You know, I would say, you probably want to think it through more than that, because there's some incoherence in the question. So you said, I'm an atheist, but, but's an interesting addition to that claim. I joined a church for the community. So, questions. Why did you join a church for the community? Right? Because that's a germane question. You might say, well, I'm attracted to the sort of people who are attracted to the church. It's like, okay, why? Why there? Like, why didn't you go join a bar? Right? Or or like a criminal gang. And you know, you might say, well, I thought there'd be good people at the church. It's like, yeah, that's a hint, buddy. So, or it could be a hint, or you're treating it like it's a hint. And so I dig a little deeper into your reasons. Now, one reason obviously is that you think you need community. Another reason is that you think you'll find a reciprocal and reliable community at the church. And then I would say you should ask yourself why you believe that. And what is it about the church that's offering that community to you, even though you're an atheist? And those are complicated questions. And I would say you're probably in the process of working that out now anyways. And if you have toddlers, you might have it worked out by the time they're old enough to have this conversation. So, but you know, another thing I would say about children and about people in general is if you don't know what to say, why don't you just tell the truth? Like, I just think you should tell the truth all the time, because what the hell else do you think is going to work? You know, this is one of the things that's so interesting about the instrumental and manipulative use of language, or about reliance on deception. It's like, well, hypothetically, the truth is what reflects the real. And the real is, it's transcendent. Like, there's more to the real than your opinion of the real, obviously. The real is what you have to contend with. And if you use deception and you knock yourself out of concordance with what's real, how in the world do you expect that to go well? And you might say, well, it's too risky to tell the truth. And I would say, well, there are stupid ways of telling the truth. It doesn't mean you have to blurt out every bloody thing that enters your head all the time, although I do that. And I'm trying to be careful with my blurting most of the time, let's say. But how do you expect, if what you're trying to adapt to is the real world, that if you twist that, that's going to work? Well, it'll work for a short period of time. It's like, no, I don't think so. How could it possibly work for a short period of time? Because you're making the presupposition that there's something about the force of your will that can twist the structure of reality in your favor, the whole structure of reality in your favor, just because you want it to, with no consequence. That's a really stupid theory. And so I think you have a right to privacy. I think you should be judicious in what you say. But I think that you should just say what you think. And so this is a good segue into a discussion about faith. So, there's a notion that there's a proposition, a religious proposition, that faith is necessary. And you can parody that, and you can say that faith is the willingness to believe in propositions that are laughably improbable. And that's often the scientific criticism of the religious. But that isn't really what faith means. Faith means the willingness to put yourself at risk to abide by a principle. So, for example, if you decide to get married, that's an act of faith. Why? Because you have no idea what bloody catastrophe you're diving into. Now, you're diving into the full catastrophe of a committed life. That's what you're doing. You're looking at this person and you're saying, no matter how rough the seas get, and what the hell do you know about that? No matter how rough the seas get, I'm not going to jump out of the boat we're both rowing. And that's really? Like, that's really what you're promising? And why? And the answer is, well, because I have faith that all things considered, that's the best solution. But you don't have evidence for that, because the evidence accrues across the course of your life. And the way that evidence accrues is going to be dependent to some degree on how firmly you manifest that faith. And so even the evidence becomes dependent on faith. And then faith in the truth is the same thing. And this is something worth knowing. You can use your language instrumentally, and people do. And they're actually quite dull and predictable when they do this, and off-putting. And so to use your language instrumentally is to target someone or some group and to decide what you want from them, and then to use your language to extract that out from them. And so you could manipulate someone into going to bed with you on a date, for example. That's a very common thing to have happen. Often there's mutual manipulation on both sides that results in that outcome. And then you think, well, I got what I wanted. And the problem with that is, what the hell do you know about what you want? Or what's good for you? And you're making the presupposition that being manipulative is going to produce a result that's good for you. It's like, which obviously indicates right away that you're not very wise. And so you don't know what's good for you exactly. Well then, but you can't just wander aimlessly through life. It says, well, so here's an axiom of faith. Whatever happens to you when you tell the truth is the best possible thing that could happen to you. Now that's a strange thing to think about. If if I want something from you and I craft my language and you deliver me what I want, then I know what's going to happen and I got what I want. But the price I pay is that I had to manipulate you, and so I'm learning to manipulate, and I got what I wanted, and I might be wrong about what I need. Now, if I just decide that I'm going to say what I believe to be the case to you, and I'm going to leave the outcome unspecified, then I'm acting in a manner that isn't commensurate with faith in my own instrumental will. What I'm doing is manifesting faith in the viability of the truth itself. And that's a fundamental claim to faith, because I would say, to the degree that I abide in truth, then I am manifesting a fundamental trust in this redemptive structure of reality itself. I'm acting as if the truth will set me free. Now, there's no way I can tell that. There's no way I can know that that is the case until I do it, which is why it requires faith. But then you might ask yourself, well, are you going to have faith in the truth or in falsehood? Are you going to have faith in the reality that transcends your presuppositions or in your own will? And you don't have a choice other than those choices. So you're going to have faith in one of those pathways or the other. Or maybe you'll, vary between both, which I wouldn't recommend. So faith is a presupposition for living in the truth. And then you might ask yourself another question, which is, well, why bother living in the truth? Well, one answer would be so that reality doesn't rise up and smite you repeatedly, which it will, if you're deceptive. So that's one answer, but here's another answer, and this is a better answer. People ask themselves all the time, what's the purpose of life? And there's a variety of answers to that. There's no purpose. We're just atoms on a dust mote at the edge of a rather reprehensible corner of the cosmos, and we exist for a moment and we're out, and that's that. Or we're so lost in a plethora of subordinate meanings that we're confused and aimless. Or we want to be hedonistically happy, and I would say that's really the offer that's on the table in our culture most of the time. It's like, well, I just want to be happy. And people will say that to you. It's a slogan. It's the most common slogan of our time, I would say, and it's such a preposterous slogan. It's like, what do you mean just? You just want to be happy. That's all. That's all you want. That absolute impossibility. You want bliss unending, no matter what you do, and that's all you want. It's not exactly a small ask, let's say, because it's the same thing as asking to dwell permanently in paradise. It's something like that. So it's not that likely. And then it also isn't true. That isn't what you want. If you do careful analysis of what people mean when they say they just want to be happy, what they mean is they don't want to suffer stupidly. We're much more concerned with not experiencing an excess of negative emotion than we are with experiencing a surfeit of positive pleasure. So first of all, we don't mean we just want to be happy. We mean, please don't make us too miserable. And fair enough, that's reasonable. But then even on the happiness front, even on the absence of misery front, that's not true. One of the things Dostoevsky pointed out in Notes from Underground, which is so bloody brilliant, he was criticizing the idea of materialist utopia. He said something like, well, imagine we made our materialist utopian dreams come true, and everybody had enough to eat all the cakes they wanted and enough to drink and nothing to do, he said, but busy themselves with the continuation of the species. And we were so pleased that we emitted nothing but bubbles of bliss. He said, human beings were so damn ungrateful that the first thing we do is take a stick and smash up all that comfortable prosperity just so that something unexpected and provocative could happen. And that's very smart. That's hearkening in some sense back to the story of the Garden of Eden and the proclivity of human beings to eat the forbidden fruit. It's like it isn't obvious at all that we want happiness. It isn't even obvious that we want absence of misery. What's really obvious is that we want an adventure, right? We want an adventure that's so compelling that it makes the misery of life not just justifiable, but worthwhile. You want to look back on your life, you know. You want to look back on your life, and you know this to be true. You want to be able to say to yourself, even considering a month or a week or a series of days, you want to be able to say, that was really difficult, but you know what? It was worth it. And I think that's what you want from your life. It's something like, you know what? That was difficult, but it was worth it. And that meant that the adventure was so great that it justified the difficulties. And so then the question is, and here's the question, where do you find the great adventure of your life? Well, how about in truth? Well, why? Because you don't know what's going to happen if you tell the truth. It's a mystery. It's going to lay itself out for you. And so that's an adventure, because you literally do not know what's going to happen. You have to let go of knowing what's going to happen. And so then you have that adventure, and then what is also the case is that it's you that's having the adventure. Right? Because if what you're doing is living in truth, that's you. That truth is you. And so that means that whatever happens when you tell the truth is your adventure. And then you think, well, I'm using deception. It's like, well, maybe you are, but maybe deception is using you. And then maybe it's the spirit of deception that's having the adventure of your life. And then you might ask yourself, well, why are you so miserable and unhappy? And the answer would be, well, the spirit of deception is having the adventure of your life. You're not even there. Because if you're not living in truth, you're not there, obviously. What's there is the spirit of deception, and you might think that's your deception, but I would be very careful about thinking that, because there have been centuries of meditation on the nature of the spirit of deception. And the answer isn't that the spirit of deception is you. The answer is that the spirit of deception is something that possesses you and convinces you that it's you. And that's not something you want to fall into the clutches of. So now you have to tell me the question again.
I'm certain you answered it. This was about teenagers.
Oh, yes. Well, back to the teenagers. Do you not want to go to college, or are you just lying about being lazy? So that's a question, and we can ask ourselves that question. And as I said, on the teenage front, craft a vision, craft a compelling vision. That's really what we are as human beings, is we're visionaries. That's how we confront the horizon of the future. We meet the horizon of the future by crafting a compelling vision. And your vision might not involve a college education, but it should be a vision that makes you think, if I could make that come true, it would justify the trouble that it would take to manage it. And I think that's the right attitude to take towards your life. And we're all going to have our crosses to bear in the most fundamental manner. We all have to deal with the catastrophe of mortality. And I think we all have to deal with the reality of hell. And you can think about that religiously or not. Political hell will do for hell as far as I'm concerned. We certainly saw no shortage of evidence for that in the 20th century. And we all have to contend with that, right? The reality of mortality and the reality of hell. And then we all have to contend with the fact that we have to develop a vision for our life that is so compelling that it justifies those bitter realities. And that's really the nature of the religious enterprise. And that's something you can embark on and should embark on young. If you're trying to figure out who you are, it's figure out who you need to be in order to justify the catastrophe of your life. And then you think, well, that was difficult. Man, that's for sure. But it was worth it. So, thank you very much. It was very good of all you to come tonight. I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you, Tim.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Lovely to be here.
That's so nice.
Thank you. Thank you all. Yeah. Good night.